I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar, all alumni, all of our existing students, and our prospective students. I think you'll find this a very exciting example of Fletcher's cutting-edge research and how we're applying it in today's world. First off, I'll just give you a touch of my background, why I'm involved in this. I'm a Fletcher graduate, 09, so I'm sort of a mature graduate, but I spent 25 years at JP Morgan in the Far East, the Middle East, Europe, and in New York. My last job there was the CEO of the private bank, and then I took early retirement in 1995, and I've been involved with data technology companies ever since. Three of those companies are one, Intralinks, in 1996 we set up, which is now used by banks and institutional investors around the world, over 1,000 users. Secondly, Credit Trade here in London, which is a credit default swap B2B exchange, which is now part of ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange. Thirdly, Hyperjar, which is a fintech startup here in London, which I'll touch on a little bit more later. I think that the main message we want to get through to all of you today is that Fletcher is not only the leading international relations graduate school in the world, but it also has a think tank within the school. And that think tank works with all of our students, with many of our students and our professors to come up with cutting edge technology and research. And that's really what we want to do today, is give you an example of that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bhaskar.
Arthur, thank you for helping us organize this session and actually being the inspiration for this. And thank you for your continuing support and partnership on everything we do here at Fletcher. And in a few minutes we will go back across the pond to where you are, Arthur, in London, and perhaps connect some of the topics of today's conversation with what's going on the ground over there in London, which happens to be a pretty interesting place, just as several other parts of the world happen to be interesting as well. Now, the purpose of today's session is looking ahead into the future, and perhaps an appropriate time, given that we are winding down on a rather momentous year, and perhaps looking ahead to not just a momentous year, but a momentous decade ahead. And many of the issues that we'll be touching upon today will be about things that will help make that connection between where we are today and how that is providing us with either a springboard or a trapdoor for what comes ahead. I just wanted to give a very quick introduction to the Institute for Business in the Global Context here at Fletcher. As Arthur mentioned, we are all of you are the finest ambassadors for the Fletcher School around the world. And I often say that Fletcher is not only the first graduate-only school of international affairs in the United States, it's perhaps the only complete school of global studies and global research anywhere in the world. And the reason why I say it's the only complete school is because we have a complete table of participants who come from the various disciplines that represent various disciplines and different walks of life that represent the underlying currents and the underlying trends that are shaping global affairs. So at Fletcher, our table constitutes not just the diplomats and the generals and the heads of development agencies or international agencies, but we also have the business people, big business and small business, the entrepreneurs, the technologists, the geek in the garage, working on the next app that might change the world. And in many ways, we are perhaps the only institution that seamlessly recognizes that it is not just intercontinental ballistic missiles and plane loads of diplomats crossing national boundaries who shape global events, but it's also data and money. And in many ways, data and money cross borders much faster than plane loads of diplomats or intercontinental ballistic missiles. So this is the place where we connect the world of business with the world, and may be the only institution that legitimately can claim to do that. And we concentrate that avenue of thinking, or that that point of intersection at the Institute for Business in the Global Context. Very handy acronym, IBGC or ICBG. Most of the time people can't say it in the right sequence, so we encourage you to say the whole thing, business and the global context. Now, in addition to thinking about all issues that are at the intersection of business and the world, we have a number of different research and convening programs that are the hubs of what we do. And one of the more significant hubs that we have within the Institute is an initiative that we call the Digital Planet. And over the last several years, about since 2012, we've been studying how digital technology is changing lives and livelihoods around the world. Currently, we're tracking about 90 countries, perhaps the only place now that has a comprehensive view of what is going on in the world through the lens of technology. And I'm sure each one of us today, right now, we are connected on a worldwide network through this technological medium. So it's only appropriate that we dive into how this technology is shaping lives, livelihoods, businesses, politics, communications, social relationships, the future of democracy. And that is the core of what we're doing in the Digital Planet. I'll just make one more observation about where we are going with the Digital Planet. Starting 2020, we're going to be launching a major initiative. The tagline for the initiative is making the digital economy work for everyone, everywhere. So if any of you are working on these issues, are interested in these issues, would like to stay in touch on these issues, do reach out to us, because we are going to be leveraging our resources here within the four walls of Fletcher and our extended community worldwide in order to address those questions. This is a set of issues that animate not only our research activities, but also our classrooms. As you know, we have a number of business programs at Fletcher, which are preparing the leaders of the 21st century to seamlessly jump across not only interdisciplinary borders or geographic borders, but those very high walls that separate business and everything else. And we want to prepare future business leaders with a sense of what we call contextual intelligence, the ability to walk back and forth between the implications of business as you go into the world of politics, into the world of sustainable development, in the world of environmental policy, in the world of human security, and so on and so forth. The Master of International Business is our residential program where we prepare our students to be leaders in truly this contextually intelligent way. We have also just launched a new degree which is all done digitally, and that is the Global Business Administration, the GBA degree. So we have a number of different ways in which we are approaching the question of education. We are in the process of launching a number of smaller and shorter approaches to educating our alumni and future graduates through shorter courses that will be done in a combination of digital and in-person meetings. So with that kind of very long-winded commercial break, Arthur, let's launch right into the heart of our conversation, the ease of doing digital business, which is one of the most recent pieces of work that we just completed in 2019, and we are using that as a launch pad for where we are going next, and therefore FletcherFutures. So over to you, Arthur.
Okay, thank you very much, Bhaskar, for that. Well, I'd like to get into some detail about this ease of doing digital business index. Could you explain what exactly is the EDDB and why is that important?
Yeah, so the EDDB, as you can tell, there's a recurring pattern here, which is we love really unpronounceable and non-memorable acronyms here. So the EDDB is the ease of doing digital business, and it is frankly inspired by another index that I'm sure most of you have heard of, and that's the ease of doing business, or the doing business rankings that are produced annually by the World Bank. And we were inspired by the World Bank's doing business analysis for several reasons. One is, as you know, we care about all things viewed through a global lens here at Fletcher. We also care about impact. Now, as I think about any piece of analysis, academic or non-academic, any piece of research work that is global and that has had impact around the world, I am hard-pressed to find anything that comes close to the World Bank's doing business rankings. Whether you like them or not, whether you have problems with their methodologies, whether you believe that the World Bank and various country governments have tensions with each other, those are all separate issues. But you cannot question the fact that this is an incredibly impactful global piece of analysis that governments look for year after year, and many governments rise and fall on the basis of how they do on the doing business rankings. And the World Bank business rankings, doing business rankings, so far have led to about 3,500 reforms across 190 countries. So we thought, wow, that's fantastic. That's the aspiration that we would have at Fletcher, to have analysis like that. Now, as we look closer at the World Bank's doing business analysis, we realize that it has a key piece missing, which is most or all of the analysis is good for figuring out whether I should be setting up a machine tool factory in Vietnam or Ghana, or whether it's harder in Vietnam, harder to do it in Vietnam or in Ghana. It is reliant on a bunch of information and data that is very good for understanding the laws and regulations that help you figure out how easy or difficult it is to enter, operate, and exit a market if you have a traditional business. But if you're thinking about a digital business, if you're thinking about setting up an online freelancing platform, if you're thinking of setting up a ripoff of Amazon in a random part of the world, if you're thinking of setting up a ride-sharing business in Ghana or in Vietnam, the World Bank analysis actually doesn't really help us. And it also turns out that the digital economy happens to be the most dynamic and perhaps the most exciting part of the global economy today. Whether you're thinking about this from the perspective of developed countries or developing countries, the digital economy is the significant part of the economy that we should be thinking about as we look at parameters of change and what is shaping the global economy of the future. So we felt there was a gap in the World Bank analysis, which is doing business in traditional terms does not tell us a whole lot about how easy or difficult it is to do business in the digital space. And there's so many ways in which doing business digitally is different from doing business in a traditional space. Let me just give you one example. I can give you 100, I'll just give you one. Think about regulations, which are often one of the first places you go when you try to understand how easy or difficult it is to do business anywhere. Today, I grew up in New Delhi, India. That's where I was born. Today, I am absolutely devastated to hear that the internet has been shut down in New Delhi, India. The internet has been shut down in the world's largest democracy, in the capital of the world's largest democracy. That is huge, okay? Now, the shutdown of the internet is happening in many parts of India. It's not just India, it's happening all over in countries across the world. Now, laws and regulations that restrict the movement of data on the internet, or laws and regulations that restrict where data can be stored, where it can be moved, how it can be used, who owns the data. These are enormously important questions, and these are the questions that we'll be grappling with in 2020, in 2030, and 2040. And these are the questions that fundamentally will help define how easy or difficult it is to run a digital platform in any given part of the world. So I just use that one example, and I feel pretty passionate about this because this has hit really close to home. Now, of course, these issues are hitting us everywhere. I sit here in Boston, where, of course, we're in one of the great digital hubs in the world, and we worry about, what is happening with data all over. So that's just one example of ways in which rules and regulations that affect the machine tool business are very different from the rules and regulations that affect digital business. So we decided that we needed to close that gap, and we created the world's first ease of doing digital business rankings. We put together a list of 42 countries where most of digital business activity in the world is done. We have about 240 odd different indicators that we are tracking. We're trying to understand rules and regulations. We're trying to understand supply side conditions. We're trying to understand how sophisticated users are and participants are on different digital platforms. And we actually studied 4 different digital platforms. Electronic commerce, digital media, online freelancing, and the sharing economy, the 4 major platforms on which people are building digital businesses. So I've gone on for a long time, Arthur. I'm just going to pause and let's have a conversation, and happy to dig in wherever you'd like to. Arthur, you need to unmute your mic. Go ahead, Arthur. I think we've lost Arthur's sound. There you go.
Like, okay. In any event, Bhaskar, the Exhibit 1 of the report just flashed up on the screen. I was wondering if we could put that back up again, and if you could just talk us through a couple of examples on that exhibit, so we can get a sense of what these 42 countries look like.
Okay. All right. Can we get that exhibit back up? All right. As you can see, we are one of the key aspects of what we have studied is market sophistication. That is one of the categories with which we measure digital, the ease of doing digital business. And market sophistication is a combination of a variety of factors, and one of them being how easy or difficult it is for users to figure out how to use the technology. And we are seeing that at work right now. We're still trying to figure out how to get a complicated chart up on a page while we have tons of people staring at it on the screen. But I'm glad we've managed to get that up there. Now, this may be a little hard to read depending on what kind of a screen you're looking at. So let me just kind of just give you the broad parameters of what you might be looking at. So that what you have here is essentially a league table, just like any kind of set of rankings. And our objective was not necessarily to sort of push a ranking up there and then get lots of attention and potentially people getting upset with us, or other people feeling extremely pleased about where they are. What we wanted to do was take an enormously complicated reality and create a mechanism to do an apples to apples analysis of how does one country compare with another if you are, say, planning to set up a motorcycle sharing company in country X versus country Y. And in order to do that, we had to sort of come up with a common metric, and that common metric then also creates a rank ordering. But the idea here is not to focus so much on the rank ordering, but to look at broad locations of different countries, and also to ask the question, why? Why is one country so much lower than another? And then that would, the answer to that question will potentially help inform what can be done to improve the state of digital business in any given country. And that could help us get some action implications for policymakers, for technologists, for investors, for businesses, and for civil society at large. So what you're looking at in the tiny mouse print up there on the screen are the rankings, and the top 3 countries on this ranking are the United States, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. The bottom 3 countries are Turkey, Indonesia, and Russia. And of course, you can see lots of little bubbles there as well. And basically what this is doing is it's breaking up this analysis into individual categories. For instance, the first column shows the World Bank's ease of doing business analysis, and so gives us a point of comparison with what the World Bank has got. The second one is essentially the Digital and Analog Foundations, a ranking of that. A third one is about data accessibility. How easy or difficult is it to actually take the data out of the country for analysis and training algorithms and potentially, generating the next generation of digital services using artificial intelligence and other forms of data, algorithm training mechanisms. And then the colored columns essentially are the four major digital platforms that we are studying, that we have studied, and a ranking of the countries along those platforms: e-commerce, digital media, sharing economy, and online freelancing. So that's what we're looking at, Arthur, visually.
Okay.
Of course, a lot to absorb, but let me just kind of pause there and see if that sparks any questions from you, Arthur.
Okay, well, that's very helpful, Bhaskar. I have obviously, I live here in London, and I'm looking at seeing that the UK is ranked number 2, ease of doing digital business. It certainly doesn't surprise me, and I'll give you a few reasons in a moment why that's the case. But I'm so pleased to see that, because we've been talking about Brexit for 3.5 years here, and barely the word digital economy has been mentioned at all. And here the UK is sitting right at the top of the list with the United States. So thank you for this chart, and I think this is something that we'll all be referring to in the future and watching as countries change their policies, how that's going to affect them. So with that, Bhaskar, I might just, with your permission, give my perspective of why the UK is number 2, slightly behind the United States, because I'm working with my company here called Hyperjar, and we're involved with everyone here on that subject. So let me just go through and spend just 2 minutes on this subject. In 2014, the United Kingdom government decided to try to make the UK the global capital of fintech, which is financial technology. This is basically the new technology, which in many cases is replacing banking services. And they focused on 4 different areas. First was talent. You had to get the best talent here. Some of it's already here in the UK because it's an international financial center, but some came from outside. And today, there are over 3,000 fintech startup companies in the UK, most of them in London, and 30% of them have CEOs that come from outside the UK. Why is that? They're coming from Asia, they're coming from the Middle East, they're coming from Europe, and they're coming from America to do their startups here because of the innovation that's provided here by the government, the capital that's here through venture capital, and angel investors in the very early stages, the regulatory environment, which is very, very important, and the FCA, which is regulates all financial services, has dedicated 5% of the FCA just to work with fintech startup companies, because they know that the FCA has to learn a lot more, but they want to guide these companies through, including mine called Hyperjar, and they help us at any time that we need some help of what we could look forward to in terms of future regulations, so we can do our programming to take that into consideration. And finally, the UK has a population of 66 million people. It's not China, it's not the United States, but it's a big enough country to prove out new models. And that's what we're doing, trying to get validation here through the regulators, and also have proof of commercial sustainability through working with other UK companies. So what we have is a payment app which has a whole bunch of features, such as savings, such as gifts, such as making it very easy to transfer funds between people. And this has eliminated the need for banks and credit cards and debit cards here in the UK. We've been in our pilot program for 1.5 years. We're going to formally launch next year. And we're now in our second round of raising money, all because we are showing a brand new way that individuals can use their smartphone to do their commercial or their consumer purchases. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to you, Bhaskar, and say thank you very much. We appreciate being ranked number 2 on there, and we hope to knock the U.S. off its top next year.
Yeah, well, that should definitely earn you a spot on the Boris Johnson cabinet. That level of optimism and can-do attitude, which the UK desperately needs, Arthur. It's great to get the perspective from the ground. From a digital company from the ground, Arthur. And this is exactly the kind of conversation that we absolutely cherish at Fletcher. The opportunity to do that, because we sit here in Boston, we take a bit of a planetary view, as it were, not to be sound too pompous about it, but what we do care about is the ability to then go back to the ground level and try to understand what are some of the issues that are affecting countries, businesses, policymakers, social sector actors, as they try to effect change and in individual countries, individual regions, cities, and so on, and then try and make the connection between the larger global patterns that we are seeing. Now, the UK is a really interesting case study in our whole analysis, is because a lot of people were surprised to actually see the UK rank this high, right? I mean, it is a very compelling story in terms of how the UK has facilitated companies like Hyperjar and others for all the reasons that you just mentioned, Arthur. Let me give you a couple of other holiday party factoids. Factoid number 1 is that we actually did some analysis of what would happen to this glorious ranking of the UK post-Brexit. And of course, the answer to that question, of course, is what the hell is Brexit? How is that going to unfold? What will happen on the other side of, on the tunnel? Because we clearly don't see any light at the other side. There's only darkness. So, how are we going to, navigate through the road that's on the other side? So we tried out a number of different variations on a post-Brexit scenario. And the interesting point here is the UK survives that. The UK still comes out as a very compelling place to do digital business. In fact, it turns out to still hold on to its number 2 rank. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is something that you just alluded to, which is the Brexit conversations that have, of course, everybody's so tired of it. I'm sure where you are, Arthur, have largely focused on, the machine tools part of the UK and the EU, which is traditional businesses. Very little conversation has occurred on the role of data. And how is the trade in data going to be managed in the region in a post-Brexit situation? It turns out that within the EU, even today, the UK is still part of the EU. If you were to take the UK out of the EU would face a massive digital recession. It already is in trouble as a region. If you think about the major actors in the digital world today, it's US and China, and to a lesser extent, a few other countries. The EU is falling behind for a variety of reasons. There's one place where the EU has taken leadership, which is creating a set of safeguards and a regulatory framework for the digital economy. And that indeed has become a beacon for other countries as they look at that framework and they try to develop their own. Other than that, the EU is falling behind. Now, the rock star within the EU was the UK. You take the UK out of the EU, it's going to be a very poor outcome for the rest of the continent. And in fact, it is also going to have an impact on the UK digital economy for a number of reasons that we can go into when we have a little bit more time. So let me just kind of pause there in terms of the conversations that we've been having about UK and EU. I'm sure there are questions from folks around the call, and I do want to give people an opportunity to do that. In terms of a few things that that we found surprising or notable, let me just give you a few kind of bottom line points, okay? And feel free to reach out to us. You know where to reach us, or read the report or an article in the Harvard Business Review that summarizes the main points. But let me kind of give you the bottom line, just because we have limited time. Point number one is that digital regulations and public policy choices are the key determinants of how easy or difficult it is to do digital business. So being thoughtful about regulating data, regulating the internet, engendering trust in the digital ecosystem is foundational. And as we all know, over the past several years, all of those foundations have been eroded, and we still we don't have clarity in terms of how this wonderful thing called the digital planet, which we are so new to. We don't quite know what the contours of the planet are. We don't know where the dragons are. We don't know, which direction to point our ships in order to reach India or America or wherever we want to go on this planet. So all of that is part of the future. And that's why this is part of FletcherFutures. We think regulating and setting the rules of the road for what's ahead for the digital planet is fundamental. It needs to come at a global level. It needs to come at a country level. Second, the infrastructure elements are enormously important for ease of doing digital business. And when I say infrastructure, I mean not just telecom infrastructure or internet infrastructure, or whether you have mobile broadband or enough mobile phones in the hands of people. I also mean physical infrastructure. So for instance, an e-commerce company relies not just on financial payments over the internet or the ability to kind of look at shoes on the internet and shoes that will follow you around across all kinds of websites. And if you like this shoe, then it'll recommend some other kind of shoe. But that shoe needs to be delivered to your home at the right place at the right time, and that delivery will require a truck to show up at your house. So we need to have trucks. We may need to have bicycles. We need to have a home address. We need to have a road to your home. So these physical elements are important. In addition to that, it's not just the physical infrastructure within a country, but the physical connections across countries, because quite often these transactions happen across border. A third thing that is going to be enormously important as countries think about how to boost their ease of doing digital business is improving the skills and sophistication of users. So much of the time, users are still coming up the curve in terms of how to use the digital platform. And that's true if you are new to the digital system, or it's true if you have been familiar with the digital system for a long time. We are all still figuring this out. In particular, we're also trying to figure out how to deal with the challenges of cyber and the cyber vulnerability that is still very much part of our reality. And this, by the way, is another direction of our work with Digital Planet going forward. We are going to be looking at the future of cyber hygiene across the world. We're also looking at the future of artificial intelligence readiness across the world. So watch the space for some of those elements. Another key point that something we discovered is that if a country is good in facilitating one digital platform, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good at facilitating all digital platforms. So you could have a fantastic infrastructure for e-commerce, but it could be terrible for digital media, or it could be terrible for online freelancing. So you have to figure out how, what are some of the underlying facilitators for each platform. And finally, it's important to recall, and this brings us right back to Fletcher, that even though digital companies, digital platforms emanate from one place, they could emanate from Boston, they could emanate from Silicon Valley, they could emanate from Shenzhen, they could emanate from Bangalore, they could emanate from Dubai, but the moment they're on the internet, they're global. They're global. So they could have an impact all over the world. So we have to have the wisdom to anticipate that impact and factor that into the way we design companies, the way we invest in companies, and the way we regulate companies. And on the point of investing, let me just make one final comment about 2019. 2019 is a year in which unicorns turned into donkeys. All these wonderful billion-dollar plus private companies, suddenly, they all went poof. And so what are the learnings that we have for going into 2020 is companies like SoftBank, which is kind of behind many of these unicorns, and several other investors, as they look at these digital darlings, you need to look at not just the experience in Silicon Valley or even the United States, you actually need to look at the global effectiveness of these companies. So if I'm going to be looking at the Airbnb IPO, which might be coming up around the corner, I need to recognize how well or badly Airbnb is doing in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in Ghana, or wherever it claims to be. The ease of doing digital business is a great way for you to calibrate the global impact of these digital companies. One final point, Netflix just recently put out some interesting analysis to its investors. And one of the key things it told investors is, don't watch for what we are doing in the United States or Western Europe. Look at our performance globally. Look at our performance globally. And there again, in order to evaluate that performance globally, you need to look at how easy or difficult it is to run a digital media business like Netflix. So with that, let me just pause here and see if there are questions from around our global diaspora across the screen here. So my colleague Ravi Chakravorti, who's our co-author in this work, he's monitoring the questions. And if you have a question, do put it on the chat platform, and Ravi will call them out.
Bhaskar, I muted you for a minute. I muted you for a minute because of the echo. So one of the questions we have is, considering the lower scores of Scandinavian and EU countries, Germany and France, etc., is it actually desirable to be on the top of the list? Because one would assume that these countries tend to have better protections of workers' rights, social contracts, etc., etc. Is there a trade-off here?
So, countries and several of the Western European countries like Germany. Yeah. Okay. So the question, I believe, is, could you just repeat the question, Ravi, so that we make sure? Yeah.
Considering the lower scores of Scandinavian countries and countries in the EU, Germany, France, etc., is it actually desirable to be on top of the list? Because one would assume these countries tend to have better worker protections, better social contracts, etc. Mm-hmm. So is it a trade-off here?
Yeah, so the question, if everybody got that question, this is a really important issue to consider. If you think about, let's take the example of one country like Denmark, which is by all measures a highly evolved digital nation. And Denmark has a number of very, very positive elements in terms of its rules and regulations and data protection laws, and some of the ways in which it facilitates a digital enterprise. However, there are certain restrictions of operating in Denmark which could present some challenges. And some of these restrictions are fairly broad. For instance, the Danish Bookkeeping Act, which prevents the transportation of Danish user data outside the Nordic region. So what that means is, if I'm Amazon sitting in the United States, if I wanted to use data from Danish users for my recommendation algorithm, I may not be able to do that. Now, that is probably a good thing from the perspective of protecting users. However, from the perspective of business, it is a source of friction in building the next generation of services. So we're not making a normative point whether this is good or bad, but really what that does is it pushes Denmark a little bit lower in terms of the ease with which you can actually do your business as a digital company. Because as you know, digital companies do a whole bunch of different things. One, they sell you products. The other, they grab your data in order to figure out what products to sell you in the future. So if they don't have a seamless way to grab your data and do all kinds of fun things with it, that makes it more difficult for them. So that's one of the reasons why many of the Nordic countries or the Western European countries like Germany, potentially are lower in terms of ease of doing digital business. One more fun fact, bookkeeping. I just found out there are very few words in the English language that actually have 3 different letters that are repeated twice in the same word. Bookkeeping happens to be maybe the only one. Okay, that's completely irrelevant. Any other questions?
Here's a good kind of good question. What are the 3 surprises that we found, in the process of this research?
So the question is, what are the 3 surprises that we found in the course of this research? Of course, there are lots of surprises when you kind of go into research that covers so many different kinds of countries in different stages of socioeconomic development and in the context of an industry that is itself evolving. Let me just name 3, not necessarily in any particular order. Surprise number 1, it actually does go back to what Arthur, you and I were talking about, which is how good the UK is as a digital destination. One doesn't automatically associate the UK as a digital rock star, but it is. And so that, I think it was a surprise. And I would seriously hope that as the crash course in Brexit, crashes into some kind of a decision in the coming months, that supremacy of the United Kingdom does not get lost, and the policymakers in the UK keep that in mind. So that's sort of, I would say, surprise number 1. Surprise number 2, if you look at Singapore, where Singapore is in our kind of overall scheme of things, most people would associate Singapore with, a digital Shangri-La. Lots of good things happening there. It's very easy to not only do regular business, but digital business for a variety of reasons. Now, it turns out that Singapore does present some challenges for digital enterprises, particularly as it pertains to the ability to move data in and out of Singapore. And some of those restrictions, some of the governmental restrictions of Singapore, and the fact that Singapore itself is not a signatory to the Open Government Partnership, is a potential problem from the perspective of digital companies that also trade in data. So that pushes Singapore lower than where one might expect. Finally, and this is the not the elephant in the room, but the dragon in the room, China. China ends up performing quite poorly in our analysis. And this is something we struggle with quite a bit, because the paradox of China is, if you are already in China and you have a digital business that's running, and the state, federal, local, provincial, is okay with what you're doing, it is one of the best places to do digital business. However, we took the perspective of, what if I'm anywhere in the world and I'm considering China as a destination? Now that makes China a very difficult place to crack for a variety of reasons, and not the least of which being, many digital companies are simply not allowed to operate, or their access is delayed. There are data localization laws. There are a variety of other rules and regulations that make it very difficult for international ventures to operate in China. So our surprise here was, how low China ranks if you were to, create that level playing field and ask the question, how easy or difficult is it to crack China versus any of the other countries? I was also quite surprised, in combination of that, to see how low Russia ranked. In fact, Russia, in our overall schema, ranked the lowest in the world, despite the fact that it does have some pretty compelling digital opportunities and some great companies and some great technologies. Let me just kind of pause there and see if there are other questions.
So speaking of China, there's one question about how some countries tend to restrict access, data access. Are they doomed to fail? And what are the results here about?
So the question is, some countries restrict access to data. Are they doomed to fail? So, it's a bit of a broad question. Let's take the example of India. Today, if you were to ask any digital company executive, whether it's a big company or a small company, and you ask them what is the highest potential digital destination in the world, it's hard to argue against India for a variety of reasons. It is a very large internet enabled population and growing. It's a very young country. It has a lot of untapped potential as a consumer market. A lot of challenges in the physical infrastructure, which potentially could push the economy into the digital space. So there are many good things about India as a high potential country to operate and run a digital business. There's also a lot of talent in India that could populate various parts of the digital value chain. Now, India has had a number of challenges from the perspective of data restrictions. One was the one that I just mentioned earlier in this call, internet shutdowns. Right now, India is going through a massive political upheaval with the recent Citizenship Amendment Act, which has caused protests around the country. Before this, there were several other actions that the Indian government took, in particular the abrogation of Article 370, which gave the state of Jammu and Kashmir special status, which had been taken away. And as a result of that, there was a crackdown in Kashmir, and part of the crackdown was the shutdown of the internet in Kashmir. And that shutdown still exists, and today is the longest shutdown of the internet in any democracy anywhere in the world. So India is probably the most visible example of untapped potential and lots of companies dying to get in. In fact, lots of companies have spent a ton of money to get in. Walmart spent $15 billion in essentially acquiring Flipkart, the largest e-commerce company in India, $15 billion, and it's now looking at this not necessarily a standard investment, but it's trying to figure out how do these data restrictions, these internet shutdowns, which, by the way, India has the world record on in terms of the number of internet shutdowns, and the data localization laws. India is requiring a number of social media platforms to essentially be able to de-encrypt their platforms and provide the government information about the source of the messaging. All of this is going to come to a head in 2020 as both companies and policymakers try to figure out what's the right balance between maintaining control of the digital ecosystem and continuing to provide access to businesses so that they can help grow the digital economy. I use India as a very almost an extreme example. It's of course a very important example, but digital laws and regulations are critical in the future of digital businesses. A good example at the other end of the spectrum could be a country like Estonia, which is almost as far as you can get from India. It's a tiny country, has got extremely forward-looking, progressive, and facilitating laws and regulations, which have made Estonia, kind of a haven for digital businesses and digital entrepreneurs. So, thoughtful laws and regulations are fundamental to unlocking the potential of digital markets.
We have another question about market sophistication and user sophistication as we measure it. Whose responsibility is to raise these levels, and what can be done about it? So are there any best practices?
So the question is there a distinction between market sophistication and user sophistication, and whose responsibility is it to raise these levels? It's an interesting question to ask, and maybe the answer is kind of it depends. Ultimately, if the objective of policy is to enhance the attractiveness of your economy, then you would want to do something about enhancing both the market sophistication and user sophistication. When I think about market sophistication, there are so many elements, both on the supply side, the demand side, and every aspect of the value chain, including laws and regulations. And you want to have a coherent set of policies that enable a smooth functioning of the market. And that, in many ways, is the responsibility of policymakers. And together with industry, because regulators and policymakers much of the time don't really understand the digital economy, largely because technology moves very fast, and it's very difficult for politicians and bureaucrats to keep up. So there needs to be essentially a public-private partnership in kind of figuring out how do we enhance market sophistication. User sophistication, one could take a paternalistic view and say, well, it's the responsibility of this public-private partnership. Both government and industry should do as much as it can to enhance the sophistication of users. And in many ways, that's true. For instance, we are seeing, one of the other studies that we have done as part of our Digital Planet research was a study of digital trust that we're going to come out with our next measure of global digital trust worldwide again in 2020. And one of the key findings of that study was that as countries are new in terms of their exposure to the digital system and the internet, they tend to be more trusting of what they see on the internet. So if I get a message on Facebook or WhatsApp in a country that is still new to this technology, a higher proportion of users are likely to believe what's on it. So whose responsibility is it to help people sort through what is true, what is half true, what is completely untrue? And one could argue it is a combination of the public-private environment to do that, but ultimately it's also the responsibility of individuals. And so I would say there's a combination, and in the developing world, there definitely is a role for policy in enabling that. Unfortunately, politicians have started manipulating the digital system for their own individual goals, as is happening not just in the developing world, it's happening across the world, and it's a reality that we're living with. In fact, the reality we're living with right here in the United States, and this will go through the roof by the time we hit election year 2020 in a few days. And it is ultimately the responsibility of policy. It's the responsibility of the companies to ensure that the sophistication of content, the sophisticated interaction between content and the platform, and the interaction between platform and user, continues to improve, and that's true everywhere.
So, to your point about policymakers really don't understand how digital business works, case in point being Zuckerberg having to explain to the U.S. Senate that they sell ads to make money. The question is, what can policymakers do to grow the good of digital business while limiting the bad? What can policymakers take away from this research? And how can governments use this work to assess themselves and sequence reforms?
So if I could paraphrase the question, as we have seen with recent interactions between industry leaders like Mark Zuckerberg and others, and the interactions with policymakers and lawmakers right here in the United States, we've seen similar interactions in other parts of the world, notably in the EU. And one thing has become quite clear is that policymakers, politicians, bureaucrats, regulators have a hard time understanding the edge of digital technology, where it's going and what's around the corner. Now, what can be done? We certainly can't leave the digital economy in the hands of Mark Zuckerberg. I, for one, don't think Mark Zuckerberg is an evil person. I think he has, what he's missing is two things. One is he should have finished college. Second, he should have attended the Fletcher School, because the ability to develop this contextual intelligence and integrate that in the way you build and operate and run and grow companies is essential. In fact, I would say Mark Zuckerberg is the single biggest poster child I can think of for why you need to come to Fletcher, because that gives you a complete understanding of how one brilliant piece of technology that you could develop in your beautiful offices in Silicon Valley could have an impact in a distant part of the world. And to be able to have that kind of foresight and farsightedness is critical for digital leaders. So I do believe that education, until it happens, we cannot leave the future of the digital economy to the people who run digital companies. We need the policy guardrails. We need the regulatory guardrails. Unfortunately, those guardrails cannot be put in place by people who don't completely understand how wide the road is, or what kinds of vehicles are traveling on that road. So what can be done? First thing that needs to be done is education. I think policymakers, frankly, should come back to the Fletcher School as well. We may need to expand, 15 times in order to accommodate all the people who need to get educated on these fronts. But unfortunately, that is a really important piece of the puzzle. The regulators and the political establishment need to come up to. It's hard to come up to speed simply because technology moves very fast, but at least have a working knowledge of where things are today and what the momentum is and where things are going and how to calibrate the rules and regulations they're thinking of and how that compares with what is being considered in other parts of the world. This is another issue, which is regulators in the United States quite often don't look laterally and look at what's happening in other parts of the world and learn from it. There is so much that is happening, not just in Europe, by the way, which does happen to be a leader in both trying to understand the future of digital technology and also how to regulate it from a policy perspective. But other parts of the world are doing some very innovative things. I think even a country like India, for all its challenges, has made some absolutely spectacular innovations in terms of digital policy and at least experiments with digital policy. So there's a lot that can be learned. So I would imagine that policymakers actually need to get out of their chambers and really understand this industry, this technologies, this suite of technologies and these products, largely because they have to provide those guardrails, and in the absence of those guardrails, we are all in trouble.
So last question is there a role for the third sector? What could the third sector do to help move the needle?
So the question is there a role for the third sector? Now, I'm not sure I completely understand what the questioner means by the third sector. What do you think is the third sector, Ravi?
The social sector.
The social sector. Well, that was my interpretation. So I'm just going to use that interpretation. What's the role of the social sector? This is, of course, a collective responsibility. A collective responsibility of all of us as users, as entrepreneurs, as technology innovators, and as people who are thinking about these issues. And so I certainly believe that the role of the third sector, the social sector, is enormously important in so many ways. One area is the social sector can often aggregate, what are in the issues that are in the interests of civil society. And there are many aspects of civil society that are affected by digital technology. Let's take one example, because I'm going to run out of time. One simple example that we are all living with today is democracy, the future of democracy. Today, many of the fundamentals of democracy are threatened by the presence of digital technology, largely because digital technology is creating a disintermediating force, which is potentially generating narratives that go outside the traditional institutions that act as filters. So what we end up with is a citizenry that is getting a barrage of information and misinformation, and on the aggregate, they don't quite know what is true and what isn't, what are the patterns that I should be following, and so on. And you could end up with a citizenry that goes to the polls or is prevented from going to the polls, is making choices that may not be fully informed. So that's just one example of what the third sector can do, is to help create a framework for both representing the interests of citizens in a democracy, but also figuring out ways in which we can help educate the citizenry in more responsible use of this wonderful thing called digital technology, which could also be an absolutely dangerous thing called digital technology, and to make it more wonderful and less dangerous. I know we've been at it for a while. I'm sure there are tons of questions, but more importantly, there are tons of perspectives and answers from all of you from around the world and on the screen, because we certainly have the privilege of being able to dive into 240 different indicators and 90 countries and all the stuff that we are awash in here in our Digital Planet research. But that doesn't mean that the answers lie over here at Fletcher. We actually, believe that many of you who are out there on, in different parts of the world, in your different walks of life, are, have these deep insights that are enormously important in our collective understanding. We actually welcome your input and a constant interaction in helping us, kind of figure this this evolving contours of the digital planet. And
can I jump in when you have a moment?
Yeah. So Arthur, not only let you jump in, but you can perhaps help close us out.
Okay. Well, Bhaskar, I am a graduate of Fletcher, which I'm very, very proud of, and I'm glad to be one of 10,000 graduates that have heard you today that will be able to use this in our day-to-day life. I'm also a graduate of the Wharton Business School, which is always ranked as one of the top 3 business schools in the world. And they were just over here in London in June, 650 Wharton graduates. And we were also talking about fintech and the digital economy. I just want to tell you, from my standpoint, Fletcher is light years ahead of Wharton. You have made this whole subject come alive, and you've brought in a much bigger context than Wharton does. Wharton's very good at what it does, but it's very transactional. What Fletcher does very, very well is it's able to bring in all of these other issues and meld them together, which I think, as you pointed out about Mark Zuckerberg's weaknesses, is really essential for future leaders in this world. So I just want to congratulate you on this presentation, but also on behalf of all the other alumni, we really appreciate getting this type of feedback, because it makes our Wharton, our Fletcher experience alive again. So thank you very much, Bhaskar.
Absolutely. Thank you, Arthur. And I think this is a great example of what a true Fletcher community is, which is we continue to learn, not only in the classrooms, not only in our research endeavors, not only in conversations in the hallway, but conversations in the digital hallway. And so we'll continue to have that, and I welcome inputs, advice, insights from all of you who are around the screen. And of course, hopefully you all have our contact information. If you don't, you can just look us up on the web. I won't try to spell out all of that here. I thank you for your time, and Arthur, thank you for inspiring us to kind of get this off the ground. In the new year, we will have a second session of FletcherFutures, and I believe we are going to be talking to Professor Al-Noor Ibrahim about his most recent work, and so stay tuned for that. Thank you. And have a very happy New Year. Happy holidays.
Thank you.